Which of the Celestials has left the largest footprint on Earth, and is the most important of them all? Which actions of just one Celestial has led to the greatest alteration in human history, which gave us some of the most iconic heroes on the pages of Marvel Comics? Kindness is not usually a term that can be applied to the Celestials, since they don't have the same complexity of emotions that many humans do. They tend to view the universe very objectively, and only want to guide the course of evolution in order to explore what life is capable of. So very seldom does any Celestial have a direct personal involvement or interest in a race aside from their general curiosities. They take notes and continue on their way. But today, let's talk about the legacy of Oneg the Prober, one of the most personally invested Celestials in all of Marvel. Oneg's primary role was not to study the concepts of life directly, but to study the environments where the Celestials would place their experiments. His speciality was planets, which made him something of a celestial geologist. He wanted to see how different minerals and different physical compositions of various planets affected the organisms that evolved in their environments, and the results were fascinating to him. His experiments eventually led him to a little-known world called Earth, one that was just beginning to sustain human life. And for this, we have to work backwards to the first host. The Celestials have been monitoring Earth for eons, and each time they return to check on the planet, it's referred to as a host. So far, there have been 4 hosts, or 4 instances where the Celestials return to Earth in order to collect data and to study their experiments. This is where they catalog information and decide whether or not the evolutionary course of the planet should be allowed to continue, or whether the planet should be reset entirely. The first host was the first of these visits, and this is where Celestial involvement with Earth first began. During the first host, the Celestials identified the dominant life form on Earth that existed right on the cusp of being primates and humans, and they referred to these creatures as Wanderers, the precursors to modern humanity. They took an organism that was almost human and genetically altered them to follow one of 3 different evolutionary paths. Gammonon the Gatherer collected a sample of the population, and the Celestials immediately went to work. Zyran the Tester wanted to stretch the limits of what his species was capable of, and so he mutated 100 of them into grotesque abominations, with no other intention than to just see if they could survive it. How far could they push their mutation before they could no longer handle it? This experiment resulted in the first earthly deviants, who were then released back into Earth and left to run amok. Satisfied with the data that was collected, it was now Nezar, the calculator's turn. He used this information to imbue 100 proto-humans with cosmic powers. Nezar wanted to create a guardian race, superior to the rest of the planet, in order to see how power dynamics would lead into different relationships. Would these superior beings protect their fellow man? Would they conquer or enslave them? Or would they use this power to abandon the planet entirely? All of these were interesting questions that he wanted to see play out, and so he created the first Eternals. When the Celestials returned to Earth, the Eternals isolated themselves and the Deviants as they had begun to construct their own underground kingdom, and this rivalry is extremely well documented. But there was one other Celestial who had his chance to experiment. One called Oneg the Prober had his own ideas. On the surface, it wasn't entirely clear what Oneg did to his test subjects, but as the eons went on, his experiments would prove to be the most significant of the 3. He understood that the planet that they were living on would become far more complex than any of them could predict. Billions of years before life had begun to evolve as we know it, a Celestial known as the Progenitor crash-landed here, injured and nearing death. At the time, the Earth had very little genetic diversity, and eventually, the Progenitor died at the North Pole. Over the eons, his body was buried deep beneath the crust of the world, and his essence seeped into the earliest plant life. This gave the Earth a very unique composition. Interactions between early humans and different sources of energy had the potential to alter each individual organism rather than changing an entire batch of them in the same way. So the Celestial wanted to see how the environment could affect these Wanderers, and their descendants, the humans. So he left dominant genes in the Wanderers, genes that would adapt to different situations, like being exposed to different forms of energy, such as gamma rays, cosmic rays, radioactive spiders, super soldier programs, and so much more. He single-handedly left humans the capacity to experiment on themselves, by accident or deliberate intention. When the Kree came down to Earth and began to do their own research on humanity, they were able to reawaken some of this dormant material, giving way to the Inhomo Supremus, otherwise known as the Inhumans. And this logic applies to every superhuman that Earth has ever produced. A being's capacity to gain superpowers in situations that should kill them is a direct work of Oneg the Celestial, and without him, superheroes as a concept on Earth would not exist. But it goes even further than this. These genes were deliberately meant to be left incomplete. He wanted to let them find their own paths, and sometimes this meant that their abilities manifested on their own without any probing or prompting from the environment around them whatsoever. One offshoot of this experiment was the X gene, the same gene that created the Homo superior, otherwise known as the mutants. The exact instance of the first mutant is not entirely clear in the comics, but we do know of Selene, a mutant from Eastern Europe who was born roughly 17,000 years ago, and used a combination of her mutant abilities and sorcery to make a name for herself during the age of the Roman Empire. Since part of her skills is an inability to age, she has lived for eons and has told her story across centuries. She is a powerful pyrokinetic and a telepath whose most notable ability is a life force vampirism. This is a fancy way to simply say that she can drain the life force and memories of anyone she touches, and can use this life energy to strengthen herself in the process. Her ability in this regard can be compared to that of Rogue from the X-Men, but by using sorcery, she has expanded her skill set beyond this. From here, mutants as we know them began to take shape, and for thousands of years, they became more and more common in humanity. We know that around this time there is evidence of a mutant known as the Forever Man, who is able to be reborn every single time he dies, making him effectively immortal. His memories, however, are wiped every time he begins a new life, and even though it is said that he has lived 10,000 lives, we have struggled to find evidence that his first life predated Selene. It's very possible that he is older than Selene, but since he cannot confirm this, and we can't either, she is more commonly referred to as the first mutant. Around 10,000 years after the birth of Selene, we know that En-Saba-Nur would rise to power in Egypt, otherwise known as the famed Apocalypse. Commonly, Apocalypse is referred to as the first mutant, but this isn't entirely accurate since both the Forever Man and Selene are older than he is. But his rise to power made him one of the most famous early mutants, putting him directly in the public eye. He was the first famous mutant, in fact, the man to impact the entire world's opinion on his race. And this is more often than not why Apocalypse gets the title of the first mutant, even though he is not. Moving on though, the X gene itself has had several offshoots, much like the M gene or the feral gene, but it's important to look at the full scope of where all superheroes come from. Humanity became a story of flexibility and diversity, since so many of them could survive conditions that could have reasonably killed them, and this makes humans one of the most unique races in the entire galaxy, since they have more diversity than just about anyone else does. To call Oneg perhaps the single most influential individual of the trajectory of the Marvel Universe seems apt, as without him, Marvel Comics as we know them would not exist, and Earth would be relatively normal despite all the outside influence from cosmic and alien entities. If not for Oneg. Had Oneg not interfered, the world would only be populated by Eternals, Deviants, and humans, who would have been caught in the middle of the conflict between the Eternals and their various enemies. Bruce Banner would have died of severe radiation poisoning. Peter Parker likely would have gotten ill and died as well after the radioactive spider bite. And likewise, the Fantastic Four would never come back from their expedition after being irradiated by cosmic waves. They would have been torn apart, and every mutant that we know of would have lived a normal, unassuming life without any sort of abnormality as far as we know. Xavier's school would have no reason to exist, and Xavier himself would have never manifested his telepathic powers. None of the X-Men would have. The world would have ended 100 times over due to how many non-superpowered threats heroes have had to stave off on any given day. And although we don't know the full reality, it definitely would have been much different. But anyway guys, what are your thoughts on the story of Oneg the Prober, and his profound effect on the universe, as without Oneg's experimentation, the world would not be as we know it in Marvel today. As always my friends, I hope you've been enjoying these Marvel lore videos. Hulk smash that subscribe button for more, and I hope you're having a great day.